The surfacing of Justin Trudeau's blackface photos this week has grabbed people's attention around the globe, so much so U.S. President Donald Trump was even asked to weigh in on the controversy earlier today. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe joins us now from Washington. Hey, Lindsay, great to see you. What did President Trump have to say?
Well, this question about what's happening in Canada certainly wasn't the first question that the president was asked. He talked to reporters about new sanctions on Iran, and he was sitting next to the Australian Prime Minister, so there were many questions on issues of interest to both of those countries. He was dealing with the ongoing controversies over a whistleblower in this country, but then he was asked about the situation with Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, and Vashi, Donald Trump told reporters he hoped he wasn't going to be asked that question. Here's his response.
I wouldn't be asked that question. It had to be you that asked it. You had to ask me that question, right, Justin? I'm surprised, and I was more surprised when I saw the number of times. And, you know, I've always had a good relationship with Justin. I just don't know what to tell you. I was surprised by it, actually.
And Lindsay, this controversy has actually become fodder for American late-night television. Tell us about that.
You know, waking up and scrolling through it, Vashi, I think a lot of these comedians were probably pretty happy to have some different new fodder instead of making fun of Donald Trump night after night. Certainly, they did take the opportunity to mock Justin Trudeau and Canada. Here's a little bit of what it looked like.
I'm not going to show you the picture because it's really bad. It's so bad that Canadians traveling in Europe are going to start telling people they're American.
There are so many problems with this photo. First of all, it's obviously never okay to do blackface. And secondly, if you are going to darken your skin, at least get the color right, okay? Yeah, Trudeau isn't dressed as Aladdin. He's dressed as Aladdin doing blackface. That's not the color of Aladdin. What are you doing?
This is pretty bad. And I just want to say, it's not us this time. Suck it, Canada.
So, yes, certainly poking fun at the expense of the Prime Minister and even the country, and a lot of people waking up to that, watching it tonight, and it's continuing today.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe for us from Washington. And Trudeau was asked what impact the photos could have on his international reputation and credibility as a leader in the globe. Here's how he responded.
My focus is on Canadians who face discrimination every day, Canadians who are racialized, who live with intolerance and marginalization as part of their daily experience, who I hurt. People who in many cases considered me to be an ally, who are deeply hurt by the terrible choices I made many years ago. I apologize deeply to them, and I will focus on continuing what I have tried to do as a leader, which is always stand against racism and discrimination at home and on the world stage.
The questions keep coming for Mr. Trudeau. He's being repeatedly asked if there are other instances. Trudeau says he is worried to be definitive about it, given he had forgotten about at least one. So how important is the international attention this controversy is getting, and what could the long-term effect on Justin Trudeau and this country be? Time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, journalist Vicky Machama and host of the Safe Space podcast. Alongside her, Andre Domise, contributing editor to Maclean's. Marty Patriquin of the Montreal Gazette joins us from Montreal, and here with me, Le Devoir's Marie Vestel. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Hi there.
Nice to see you. Andre, why don't I start with you? I know there are so many aspects of this conversation, certainly the conversation that it's prompted about the realities of racism in this country as well. There's a lot of reaction outside these borders. What do you make of it?
The problem that I had with it from the get-go is that it seems like the only time that we have these conversations is when there's such an egregious example of racism that you're forced to not look away. But then the structural problems tend to get overlooked. So we've been talking about this for the last 2 days. But, you know, there have been structural problems in Canada literally for decades. You know, I think the moment when the personalized racism and the structural racism intersected was when Prime Minister Trudeau was confronted by protesters from the Grassy Narrows First Nation. Right. And the response to that was to say thank you for your donation, rather than addressing the fact that they've been living on land that's been mercury poisoned for decades. And the provincial and federal governments haven't stepped up to their role and done anything about that. That was the moment when we should have had this conversation. This is just, you know, a step on the steady decline.
Vicky, what do you, I mean, there's a lot of people saying that, and I wonder as well as, I mean, the conversation was percolating certainly around Jagmeet Singh in this election, and sort of the discomfort, as it was described by some, of candidates in New Brunswick or people in Quebec. And I'm wondering how you think that factors into this as well.
I think race is always the subtext of our politics, regardless of whether there was an election. What ends up happening, however, is we focus on the acts of racism, and to Andre's point, to the exclusion of any conversation about how to either disrupt racism or to more fully support racialized communities. And so I think it actually goes further back. I mean, in 2015, there was a moment where Justin Trudeau made a comment about communities with absent fathers and music that has misogynist lyrics. And we had a very brief second in which we discussed what that implied, but he was never asked about it. I also think back to Sophie Trudeau, singing a Negro spiritual at Black History Month. We didn't have a conversation about race then. What ends up happening is we focus on the moment, and we think of it as silly or as a sideshow. And what ends up happening is we've dismissed whole conversations about how racialized communities are affected.
We've also had a lot of people, Marty, bring up on the show that this should be an opportunity for people to ask of the political parties and for them themselves to put forth like specific policies to combat with the reality that everyone should be confronted with right now, and that is the state of racism in this country. So far, I mean, I've asked a number of Liberals even yesterday who were on the show, like, what are some specific things you're going to do to combat what's so evident right now? And I haven't heard much from any of the parties where that is concerned. What does that say?
It tells me that there's a lot of lip service going on. And I mean, the one thing that I would say about this whole scandal, and barring some, huge barrage of further blackface pictures of Justin Trudeau, I think he's going to weather this. And it goes back to something that Andre said. We have an issue of structural racism in this country. Give me an idea of who in this country, what party will be able to address that and or claim to address that, has any chance of getting into power. There's one. It's the Liberal Party of Canada. The quote-unquote ethnic vote, which I'm using that because it's a vulgar term, but is basically a prisoner to this party. Radio-Canada, for example, was doing a streeter the other day and went to Maison d'Haïti in Montreal's North End, and they went in to go talk about Justin Trudeau and blackface and how awful it is. They showed up at a party that was celebrating how great Justin Trudeau was and how great his dad was, because he's the only this is the only party that has ever done anything for them. I think that coupled with 157 more apologies in the next month is going to cover a lot of sin about what happened the last 2 days. And I'm not saying that as a value judgment. I'm just saying I think that's the reality.
I don't think that's incorrect. I think it's, but if you go down demographically, I don't think that's true. I don't think that younger voters who are racialized are as captive to the Liberal vote. I also think that the demographics work out differently in suburban ridings across the country and in other, bigger urban cities like, Calgary and Edmonton, where the demographics are shifting and they're changing and they're absorbing more racialized minorities. I think that maybe in this election it won't have an effect, but there's a long tail here that we're going to see. And the fact that no party has a substantial policy about addressing at least racism, if not supporting racialized communities outside of Indigenous people, and I think those policies are excellent. The fact that they're not making it central to their platforms this election, that's a problem.
Even on that note, Nathan Obed is on the show a little bit later, and he talks about how there's really a lack of policies for combating racism against Indigenous people in this country too, and that they're even all grouped into one category when Inuit and Métis and First Nations are very different, right? And they're still literally 48 hours into this. I've yet to see one party, like Vicky says, come forth and say, here are 3 things that we can do as a federal government if we're lucky to form it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vicky's right that the debate so far hasn't really been about how we take this forward, other than acknowledging that maybe some of us screwed up in the past. I don't know how this will affect Justin Trudeau this time. Perhaps Marty's right that this time it might not have that much of an effect because we're going to keep talking about it, but Mr. Trudeau will keep apologizing, and the players in this election maybe will end up making that Mr. Trudeau ends up surviving just because of the other options that people maybe like less. But I do wonder, though, as Vicky suggested, if this is, though, a longer-term test. I think this definitely hurts Mr. Trudeau's brand as being, open and committed to multiculturalism and committed to reconciliation. The Grassy Narrows example that Mr. Singh keeps bringing up is a good example also of something that was said in private that doesn't really match what was said, what keeps being said in public. And I think it's not a surprise that the Liberals tried to change the channel today, and I think it's not that much of a surprise that Mr. Trudeau said he would be calling Mr. Singh, because I think he has to diffuse this if he wants to actually hope to move past it and start talking about something else next week or the following week. Otherwise, this will just keep haunting him, because the message of the two other parties, I find, is smart in the sense that Mr. Singh is suggesting that there's a pattern of Mr. Trudeau saying one thing but then saying the other in private, or acting differently. And Mr. Scheer's message that perhaps Mr. Trudeau lacked judgment, that in 2001 he was 29, he was a teacher, maybe he should have known better. Those two things I think will percolate in people's minds, and perhaps, yes, the vote of some cultural minority communities was acquired to the Liberals, but I think this might actually shake things for this election or others down the road, where they might think, wait a minute, do we have to vote for this guy or this party?
Andre, sorry, I just want to bring Andre in, because there's the point that you made at the beginning, rather, that people have this discussion now and they should have had it before, or it's just happening artificially almost. And I'm paraphrasing you. What has to happen, do you think, in order for this to this discussion to persist outside of the political things that we're talking about right now, but the more important stuff? Like, what do you think needs to happen in order for that to continue and it not just be like the other examples that you pointed to?
I think what has to happen is that we have to pull the lens back and understand that anti-racism can't be discussed in a vacuum. When you're talking about, for example, environmental policy, you're talking about anti-racism. When you're talking about economic policy or foreign policy, you're still talking about anti-racism. For example, trying to push through the Trans Mountain Pipeline over the objections of sovereign First Nations communities, that is an anti-racism matter, it's an economic matter, and it's also an environmental matter. So understanding how these intertwine with one another, understanding that you can't create policy in isolation. If it affects a community in terms of racialization, it's going to affect them in terms of their economic well-being. It's going to affect them in terms of their material well-being. I think that trying to talk about race as though it's a thing that exists that you can placate by just being nicer to people is where we got off on the wrong foot.
Marty, I cut you off. Sorry, go for it.
No problem. Just about the sort of the short and medium term implications of what happened over the last couple of days. I must have watched, and again, we're in anecdotal territory here. There hasn't been much polling, and even polling is difficult to nail down on this kind of thing. But I must have watched, 5, 6 streeters yesterday on various networks, CBC included. The number of people that were indifferent to this, and not only that, were heartened by the fact that Mr. Trudeau was showing contrition over and over and over again, kept coming back. Whereas just juxtapose that to where a lot of us sort of start our day, which is on Twitter. The wall between that, on Twitter, it's like the same 15, 20 guys and women whose complexion looks a lot like mine, speaking and ripping their shirts off, saying how outraged they are. On the street, I don't see nearly that outrage.
Vicky, last word in this segment to you.
I think there are structural changes that are small and big. Only this year did this federal government put in a Black chief of staff. So that's who's making sets of decisions. Indigenous people are fully represented, other communities are represented, but Black people only just got representation this year. And so I think we're far, far behind where we should be. I think that there are major changes. There are some credits to give this Liberal government, but I don't want to give this Liberal government credit at the exclusion of demanding more robust platforms from every single party that address race or that talk about how their issues counter or deal with racism or racist issues. I think that's a real failure of our press, of conversations like this, but it's also a failure of the parties themselves, and they're going to see ramifications from it from young voters, from women, and for people for whom their racialized experience is the primary lens through which they vote. And I think that will be an impact on this election. We don't know the numbers yet, but maybe it won't be this election, but I think it'll be at least another election.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.